Hello, everyone. Thank you to those that are joining us live or watching the recording for being with us today. My name is Karen Kwasi, and I'm joined by my colleague, Catherine Johnson. We are representing the Educating All Learners Alliance content team. If you're unfamiliar with the Educating All Learners Alliance, or EALA, as we often call it, we are an uncommon coalition of organizations established in early 2020 as a result of COVID-19. With remote learning becoming the norm, we realized that there would be a gap in services provided for students with disabilities. Since then, we've gone on to establish an extensive resource library, produce podcasts and webinars just like this, and many other resources to support educators as they support their students. A few months ago, we started this series where we share the top resources from the previous month within our resource library, and then we give theme resource recommendations that you can use for the following month. You can find the entire series as well as several other resources on our YouTube page called Educating All Learners, as well as our website, educatingalllearners.org. Since we're now in May, we'll be providing you with our top resources from April, and this month's theme is focused on mental health in support of Mental Health Awareness Month. So we will provide recommendations to help educators support students' mental health. And with that, I will now pass it over to Catherine to get started on our case studies.
Yes, thank you, Karen. And we thought it was important, especially since, as Karen mentioned, it is Mental Health Awareness Month, to highlight some of these great resources that we do have to prioritize and recognize student mental health and how you can intervene as educators or parents or just members of the community to help the mental health practices for our students. But we will go ahead and start with the top or most popular resources from our site and our resource library from April 2022. Our first one is a case study called Growth Mindset and Mindfulness at a Distance. This has always remained a very popular one of our case studies in particular. It spotlights, it's actually was spotlighted too on last month's discussion on remote learning and appeared this month as a top resource, so we're not surprised. Juliana Erbitree, the 2021 National Teacher of the Year, leads an inclusive class designed to help students manage the emotions of daily life in school, which we know is so important now. So during distance learning in particular, she helped students find helpful strategies to center themselves when they're feeling big emotions. She proposes using this time to continue to build community and relationships, even if you're in a virtual setting, so that students feel safe when they need their teacher's support. Our next top resource from April is called the Opportunity for Stronger Connection to Your School Community. In this case study, a high school special education teacher who teaches in a self-contained classroom discusses positive changes to his practice and classroom community during distance learning. And he also goes over practical tips for strengthening communication in classrooms where the first language of many parents is not English, while also improving overall relationships with your classroom community. So that is a great read for anybody who's hoping to foster better connections. And as it mentions, especially if you are teaching or living in a community where English is not the prominent language. Our next top resource we're really excited to see. It is a resource compilation from our partners at Digital Promise and Brooklyn Lab Charter Schools, called Individualized Education Plans, or IEPs, processes grounded in the science of learning and development. They released this guide that embraces a whole child and strengths-based approach to rethinking IEPs. And in doing so, it incorporates the latest research on learning and brain development to create and share resources, reflection tools, and guidance to support the work of teachers as they strive to update their approach to IEPs. And our last top resource from April is a case study that is really great. It's out of the Oakland Reach Citywide Virtual Hub called Prioritizing Community and Belonging in Distance Learning, the Oakland Reach's Citywide Virtual Hub. That is a distance learning program that was launched during COVID-19. And the Chief Program Officer, Michael D'Souza, illustrates the potency of shifting power to families and prioritizing a sense of belonging and cultural identity while gaining political traction at City Hall. Their individualized approach has been transformative for the learners and their families, including those with disabilities. So definitely worth a read about how to connect learners and their families to the community. So now we'll move on to our theme for this month. As we mentioned, it's best practices for prioritizing student mental health. These are only a small segment of the many, many resources we have in our resource library on not only student mental health, but also educator mental health. So we really encourage you to check that out if you want to take an even deeper dive into the resources we have available this May. So our first one is mental health intervention for students, when and how to act. And this is just a great guide to learn the observable student behaviors that indicate that there might be a need for mental health intervention, associated risk levels for each, and recommended actions. So it's a really great resource to start out with to provide kind of a blueprint for any of those warning signs that you might see in your students that could warrant follow-up. Next is kind of from the parent and family perspective. It is actually a video webinar called Reading the Signs. Does your child need help, or is this the new normal? And as they describe it, everything in our lives is changing so suddenly due to the pandemic. Even though we're 2 years in, we know it's still a volatile time for a lot of people, and still it's causing a lot of mental health stress for a lot of students. So it can be difficult to tell if a change in a child's behavior is a problem that requires intervention. Is it a cry for help, or just a temporary reaction that will resolve on its own with time? So throughout the webinar, they share advice from mental health experts about signs and symptoms of mental health problems that require professional help, and how parents and teachers both can identify students who are struggling and encourage students to stay connected in healthy ways. Our next resource is a great case study called Building Relationships with Diverse Learners. While it doesn't center directly on mental health, the case study does highlight an 8th grade teacher in Michigan whose primary focus is to connect and support students. So even though it doesn't directly address mental health, it does go over how teachers can maintain that connection with their students, which of course we know is a proactive approach to supporting those students, especially students with special needs. And in this case study in particular, we wanted to highlight it because she shares 5 key tools and activities that she can use to help make those connections with her students, so they're easily implemented by other educators. And one of those tools is our Partner Along, which is a free tool to maintain connections and check-ins with students. Our next resource is called Supporting Child and Student Social, Emotional, Behavioral, and Mental Health Needs. This is a really great resource that highlights 7 key challenges to providing school or program-based mental health support across early childhood, K through 12 schools, and higher education. So it's a huge span of support and resources that can provide educators with a blueprint for supporting those mental health needs. And it presents specifically 7 corresponding recommendations. It also has an appendix that provides additionally useful information, including examples corresponding to the recommendations, highlighting implementation efforts that have been successful across the country, a list of federal resource centers, and a list of resources specific to education in implementing those recommendations, as well as guidance on existing programs that can support the social, emotional, and mental health needs of students. Our next resource is virtual counseling tips for school-based mental health counselors. This is a case study directly appealing to our mental health workers within schools, so school counselors, social workers, anybody who works directly with those needs. It was conducted at Thompson Intermediate School in Houston, Texas. A survey of its middle schoolers at the start of the 2021-2022 year revealed that many students were experiencing stress and difficulty relating to teachers, peers, and family, which is not surprising given the events of the last couple of years. So in that resource, the Thompson leadership team decides to introduce Along and other connection tools as a way to prioritize student health, specifically with nonverbal students. Our next resource is actually a podcast called Creating a Mindset Shift, Mental Health, Climate, and Culture in Schools. This is a podcast episode from the series called Conversations About Student Mental Health. The whole series is really a great listen, but we wanted to highlight this episode in particular because it does explore the mindset shift that's necessary to create a culture and climate of mental health and wellness in a school. Making this shift is one of the 3 critical facets of maximizing the mental health and wellness of students. And our last resource that we're going to highlight is called How Has the Pandemic Affected Students' Social Emotional Wellbeing? A review of the evidence to date. And this is a survey from the Center on Reinventing Public Education that compiled hundreds of studies and convened panels of experts to interpret what the data showed during and after the pandemic. 3 initial reports assess what we know to date about the pandemic's effects on students' academic progress in particular, and that effect on mental health and social emotional well-being, particularly in the impact on students with disabilities. So that is actually a living document that's updated as assessments become published and available and add more topics over the coming year as new data comes out. Again, this is just kind of a snippet of the many resources we do have available in the resource library focusing on mental health. So please feel free to visit us and go through those resources because May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and it's such a critical component, especially for diverse learners.
Yes, thank you so much for everyone for tuning in and joining us. We hope that you were able to gain a lot of new insight, and you'll check out these resources as Catherine mentioned. They are all available on our site, educatingourlearners.org, as well as so much more. There's so many more resources that you can dive into. And as Catherine mentioned in the beginning, not just for students, but for educators as well, because it's important that the ones catering to the students are also, their mental health is in check and they have resources to support them as well. So yeah, with that, we thank you and we will see you next time.